Good evening and welcome to our webinar this evening. My name is Nicola Palmer. I am the Marketing Manager at the Rural Planning Co. As we are all aware, these are financially testing times for farmers and many are exploring opportunities to convert ageing or redundant buildings in a bid to raise revenue. Our webinar this evening focuses on whether using farm buildings for commercial use is an option for your farm. We will aim to set out the main things you need to be aware of from a planning, legal and commercial viewpoint. We will firstly hear from Alex Pinhey from Thrings Solicitors. Alex is a commercial property lawyer. He has particular expertise in acting for national and regional providers of SIPs in the acquisition and disposal of property and the leasehold issues arising during the life of the investments. Alex is going to cover off why it is essential to set up a commercial lease. We will then hear from Slade, who will talk us through establishing the value, use and demand of your building. Neil is a director at Harris Lamb with over 20 years experience dealing with commercial land and property. Neil covers all aspects of commercial agency, including leasehold and freehold disposals, acquisitions, development and redevelopment advice and consultancy. Hannah Moule, founder and director of the Rural Planning Co, will then cover off how to get the right planning in place. Hannah is a rural chartered surveyor and planning consultant with not only a wealth of knowledge, but also what can only be described as huge passion for agriculture and rural business. Hannah also farms alongside her husband in Worcestershire and strives to help farmers achieve their goals through effective use of the planning process. We will be taking questions from the audience during the presentation. Please feel free to post these on the chat and we'll cover them off during or at the end. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Alex.
Review, so if it's to be upward only and if it's to be to open market value or in line with RPI or possibly a combination of the two. But without that being in a lease, there's you could be settled with your initial rent for whatever the contractual term is. You'll also want the lease to set out what that contractual term is and whether either party is going to have a right to break it during the lease. Now we would advise against rolling lease arrangements, which can be void for uncertainty. The law loves a bit of certainty. So if in doubt, it would be best to have a longer lease term with breaks during it rather than a lease which the parties assume will roll on at the end of that term. I think Hannah's going to come on to the use point in terms of planning, but what the lease says a tenant can do is completely different to what the planning says a tenant can do in a given property. So it'll need to be clear what use is permitted in the lease itself. It can be with reference to the planning use classes, but not necessarily, and should be viewed as a different issue. And one very important point in a commercial lease, if it doesn't say anything about assignments, so that's the ability of a tenant to pass on the lease obligations and liabilities to another party, or subletting, then the tenant can do what they like. The starting point should be that all assignments and subletting is prohibited or permitted with certain conditions being met. But if there's no assignments or subletting clause there, then you might find yourselves with tenants you didn't bargain for without security by way of rent deposits or guarantors or anything of that nature. You also want to make sure that a lease contains all obligations for a tenant to pay or reimburse the landlord for things like insurance rent, so building insurance costs commonly passed to tenants, and if there are any common items of expenditure, so if they are sharing access ways or utilities or the costs of, I don't know, gritting roadways or paths, that needs to be set out, and the tenant obliged to make those payments. Again, they won't be implied into a lease. And it's also important for a lease to cover exactly what the tenant's repairing obligations are. If there's no repairing clause, then the tenant only needs to keep a property clean and tidy, whereas a full repair lease which is probably where you'd start negotiations, a tenant has to hand a property back almost as new, or you might agree something in between where a tenant only has to hand the property back in the same condition it was at the start of the lease. And if that's the case, there needs to be evidence of what the condition the property was in at the start of the lease, and that would be by way of a schedule of photos showing that condition. So the landlord's got a fair bit to lose if the repairing obligations aren't set out. The forfeiture provisions contain the landlord's right to bring a lease to an end if the tenant is insolvent or has breached the covenants of the lease or hasn't paid the rent. So that's key, and again won't be implied, or rather you can only forfeit for non-payment of rent if there's no specified forfeiture clause in a lease, so that need to ensure that's in there. And coming on to the final part, the Landlord and Tenant Act, we'll see why that's relevant here. There are 4 sections in the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954 which confer on a tenant security of tenure. So that is a tenant's statutory right to remain in the property at the end of the term and to renew the lease, which if you've fallen out with a tenant might not be the news you want. And if a tenant is well advised, they can make it very, very difficult to be removed from the property, or even very difficult to agree the terms for a renewal. So it's important, especially important, to make sure that the lease that they are granted does what it needs to do, so that at least if they are in there, they're on sensible terms. But also needs to be considered at the start of the lease whether, in fact, those rights should be excluded. We'll come on to the exclusion shortly, but there are some limited circumstances where a landlord can refuse a statutory renewal. So if a tenant serves notices to claim a new lease at the end of the term, a landlord can refuse. There are, I think, 6 grounds, but the two most common grounds of refusal are if a landlord intends to occupy the property for themselves, or if a landlord intends to redevelop the property. Now, quite a high bar is set as a test for whether the landlord's intentions are honourable, and they have to be demonstrable plans and ready to implement. So it doesn't get you off scot-free. But also, if a landlord is successful in refusing those rights, then they will also have to pay a tenant compensation for effectively their removing them from the property, and that can be quite an expensive enterprise, with the compensation being roughly equivalent to the rateable value of the property. So it's not peanuts. So key to know, and what a solicitor or a good agent acting on the grant of a lease should be able to deal with the exclusion procedure, so that the tenant won't have a right to renew at the end of the term. And that procedure is by way of a service of a formal notice on the tenant, usually by the landlord's solicitor, and the tenant swearing a declaration to say that they've received that notice, understood that notice, and there needs to be clauses in the lease confirming that procedure has been followed through. And that means at the end of the term, the tenant will not have a right to remain in the property or a right to a new lease. So you can effectively begin negotiations again, or if relations have failed between landlord and tenants, you can be comfortable that they will have to leave the property. So that brings on to the last part of the, not necessarily an obligation to put in a lease, but something to consider in granting leases to tenants is obligations. So as of April of this year, it has been unlawful to continue to let properties which are rated below an E for energy performance standards. Now, prior to April, it was only new leases that had to be above that standard, but now landlords can face penalties, and they are financial penalties brought by trading standards if properties are continuing to be let with an F or G rating, and those penalties I think depend on how long the breach has gone on and what efforts have been made to put right, but I think it's up to £10,000 or a percentage of the rateable value if higher. Again, so worth bearing in mind and taking advice on before a lease is granted, to ensure that, well, if works are required to bring a property up to standard, that they can be before the lease is granted. There are some exemptions. Some buildings are exempt EPCs altogether. That's if they are of a size that doesn't require them. That's below 50 square meters, or if there's low energy use. For instance, if it's an open-sided building with no heating provisions, that would be exempt from having an EPC in the first place. Or penalties can be exempted if the works that are required to bring a property up to standard require consent of a third party, which hasn't been or can't be obtained, or if it could take more than 7 years to pay back the cost of the works from the savings which they create, or if the carrying out the works would devalue the value of the freehold. So that a bit of a whistle stop around MEs, but I think I thought it relevant to the possible circumstances you might be facing. So that was it from me. I don't know, Nicola, if we want to do any questions on that now, or field it in the end, or see if Neil is.
Yeah, I think at the end for the question that's come up. So let's have another go at Neil and technology.
Can you hear me first?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right, we're on. Great. Okay.
Brilliant. So we just need to share your screen. That's it.
How's that?
We're on.
Okay. Right. Evening, everybody. Yeah, as per the earlier introduction, I'm Neil Slade, director in the commercial agency team at Harris Lamb. I thought it'd be useful just to give a bit of an overview as to what's been happening in the wider sector, the industrial sector predominantly, which is where we're seeing most activity at the moment compared to, if you like, the office market, retail market, where we're seeing a lot of discussions going on with farmers in terms of their buildings, taking it from agricultural use over to commercial. Is predominantly for industrial use, albeit I'll speak later in the presentation, but that is in the main dictated by the buildings themselves. But in terms of the industrial market, going from COVID, prior to COVID, the market was good. It was perhaps impacted by certain uncertainties at the time, given Brexit was causing a few headaches, whether it be with occupiers, with funds, landlords, the general election at the time as well, that was giving some uncertainty. But we got through all of that, headed into 2020, hit pandemic, and we didn't quite know what was going to happen. What did happen in the first couple of months, so certainly by sort of late spring, early summer of 2020, the industrial market exploded. The demand was unprecedented. The take-up of industrial property was very good. It took the market perhaps by surprise. So it started off with deals at the time, so PPE storage. We were doing short-term deals with logistics businesses, 3PLs for the NHS and such like. But what happened later in the year was a reaction to how we as consumers changed with the lockdowns. So rather than hit the supermarkets and the high street, we started as a country and across the world started hitting the internet. Online sales grew exponentially, and what that means is that the consumer expects whatever they're buying online to be at their doorstep, ideally same day, if not within 24 hours of ordering, rather than waiting what could have been weeks to get certain products. What that means is that those products need to come into the UK, and where are they stored? They go into warehouses. So there's a lot of take up from e-fulfillment businesses to store a variety of products in warehouses across the Midlands and beyond. That had an impact on the supply levels, so that started to dwindle. We also saw a number of onshoring exercises, which is essentially where businesses had been reliant on products coming in from overseas, and with Brexit as well, there's more reasoning to store products in the UK. So over the sort of 2020 going in and through 2021, the supply of industrial buildings reduced significantly to the point where there weren't any industrial buildings of certain sizes and certain specifications in given locations, and rents duly started to increase. Developers have been very active in buying up land to build more units. The market today is perhaps a little bit different in that there have been some further uncertainties, which again I'll touch on later, but the sort of cost of living, inflationary issues, cost of debt, more importantly, that has stymied the pipeline of industrial units, but it hasn't impacted the demand to the point where rents continue to go up. There is demand. There is demand for all property types within the industrial sector, so whether it be older industrial units, brand new buildings, small cottage style industry units, starter units, distribution buildings of all shapes and sizes, there is a demand. So for agricultural buildings, whether they be basic competitively priced buildings, there's a demand for them as much as brand new units. Office and retail markets, the last point there, they have been impacted differently. It's perhaps more to discuss at another point in time, but farm buildings, steel portal frame buildings, those are where we're seeing most of the activity at the moment. In terms of the possible alternative uses, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but classifications on the left-hand side there, but the industrial sector is where we're seeing most take-up. Storage and distribution businesses, some production businesses, to a degree manufacturing, but there may be some limitations in converting agricultural buildings to manufacturing from the needs of the manufacturers. But those are the main sectors that we are seeing from an industrial perspective. But other farm buildings, small pig shed style buildings, brick built, tiled roofs, rural offices, there is a demand for those, perhaps not so much as the industrial, but these schemes are being seen. More studio developments, there are local schemes to me in Worcestershire where these have been highly successful with niche fledgling businesses. Retail, farm shops, we've got a part of the Harris Land business specialise in garden centres and farm shops, and there is certainly an increasing demand from the consumer to shop at farm shops in terms of what they offer, and invariably go hand in hand with a cafe offering or a restaurant. That is more of a niche offering, but it is something that that can be of value. And then land and leisure sector, so you're looking at strategic land for commercial residential development, subject to size and location. Open storage can be used on farmland as well, whether that be for container storage or simply storing of products in the open air. Battery and solar farms, we again advise on those. Battery farms are viable for sort of more non-productive land that some farms may have. And then there are sort of leisure uses which are starting to come through, such as glamping and so on. Key factors, this is the last slide, but the key factors for owners of agricultural buildings to consider would be macro and micro location will impact on the success of the buildings. So if you have got a collection of sheds that are tucked down the back of a country lane, inaccessible, that will be less appealing to the logistics sector, to parties who want to use it for storage and distribution than those perhaps who've got better road links, the amenities, the working environment in terms of how you're going to get your staff. The location will impact, and it's always worth looking on a case-by-case basis as to viability. Look at the specification, think about what the end user will want from the building. So, the working height of a particular building, what can you do with it? Will that impact on the cubic capacity? What can people store in those buildings? Are there restrictions getting goods in and out the buildings? The money that is spent on those properties, the condition of them, are they wind and water tight? How much you need to invest in the property? Do you need to put your toilets and office accommodation into the building? They'll all have an impact on the rents that can be achieved for the buildings, the time to dispose of the properties, and the demand from the various sectors. ESG credentials, that has been discussed, but that is an ever increasing important part of the market. So as Alex has said, buildings below an E can no longer be let without the EPC rating being improved, and going forward that will tighten. So by certainly into the next decade, you will need to get an EPC of C or above, so taking it from E up to C. And what that will mean is just further thought, whether that be today, thinking about the future, or something that will need to be addressed in the future, about getting that EPC A, B. That is what you need to achieve. It's an A or a B. Invariably, it's the roof coverings, putting in LED lighting as opposed to any sort of older sodium box lighting and such like fluorescent tubes. Gas, that invariably has been stripped out by commercial landlords now, taking it out of buildings, switching over to electric. Insulation, so working with an EPC advisor, building surveyors, on getting as good an EPC as you possibly can today is worthwhile. Planning, not only is it important to get the appropriate planning consent, but also make sure there are no onerous conditions attached to that planning. For example, you wouldn't want to get a storage and distribution consent that would limit the operation on the site, that would be unworkable for the future operator. The costs of conversion at the moment are high, and the cost of building new units is high as well, so you need to look at the viability. Some businesses will sign up to long-term leases, some may not, and agricultural buildings, which invariably do not have sort of prime locations, you may need to offer more flexible leases than an established business park down the road. So you need to look at the cost and return, and that's something that advisors can do working with you. And then of course the impact on the core business. So it's simply, if you are a working farmer, if you have got a working farm, what will those operators be doing at the end of the farm drive? Is it something that could impact on the security of your own business? Is it something that could impact on the farm itself? So a number of considerations, and it would need to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. That's great. The first question is regarding planning. So I think what we'll do is we will hand over to Hannah now, and then we'll answer the questions at the end.
How are we looking? Can you see that?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Good evening, everybody. I'm Hannah Moule from the Rural Planning Co. It's really nice to be here this evening, and thank you all for listening. And obviously, thank you to Alex and Neil for their very valuable input so far. So my part of the webinar is to cover the planning, and when we're using farm buildings for business use, what planning do we need to get in place for that to happen? So I'm predominantly going to, within this webinar, I'm predominantly going to cover sort of letting large buildings out, or letting buildings out for things like storage, warehousing, distribution, light industrial, workshops, that sort of thing. I'm going to just touch on some of the more niche uses later on in the presentation, but really I'm just talking about this sort of larger scale letting out a whole building for some of those aforementioned uses. And I'm also really just in this webinar going to cover existing buildings, so changing the use of existing farm buildings to those commercial uses. I'm not really going to, within this webinar, touch on building new buildings. That's a slightly different beast, but obviously if you want to talk to us about that, then just please pick up the phone. So in order for me to explain to you about how the planning works, I just wanted to cover a couple of technical sort of definitions so as that you can understand what I cover in the rest of the presentation. So in respect of what we're talking about today, the thing that you need to remember is that the planning regime principally covers two things. The first one is something called operational development, and that is where you are building something, that is developing land, that is something that is attached to the land, that is a new build development of some description within the realms of what we're talking about today. So that's operational development. But the planning regime also covers what you can do with buildings and land, so the uses of buildings and land. So it's not just about what you can build, it is also about what you can use buildings and land for. And obviously what we're talking about today, that it really comes into that second part. So how the planning regime deals with that second part is there has been in existence for quite some time a class use order, which is basically a list which groups together types of uses into into a group of a type of uses, which means that when they use that so as that these types of uses that are similar to each other are within one use, and then obviously if you need to go from one type to another, that becomes a change of use. So when you go from one in the list to another in the list, that is a change of use which either requires permitted development or a planning consent to change that use, and that's the way that the planning system and planning regime works. I will refer today to something called permitted development. Now, most things, as an overarching point, most things that are operational development or the change of use of land and buildings. So agriculture is like a null use, it's a base level use. So once you come out of agriculture and start to use it for something else, generally speaking, that requires planning consent. But what there is within the planning legislation is something called the General Permitted Development Order, which is the GDPO. And what that does is it sets out certain things that can happen, certain uses that can take place without actually expressly seeking planning consent for it. So what the government has basically done is already given planning consent through this permitted development order for certain things to happen without you needing planning consent. So permitted development, and there are permitted development rights which benefit agricultural buildings to commercial. So I'll explain those to you, but that's basically the premise of what permitted development is. So these, going back to our class uses, these are the most common ones. So there's B2, B8 and E. And these are the most common ones for these like larger scale things. So B2 is general industrial, B8 is storage and distribution. And then you might be familiar with some terms like B1, light industrial, offices, things like that. Now, back in, I think it was in COVID, maybe 2021, Boris decided to, I think it was all to do with sort of instigating the economy and moving things along and making planning easier for businesses. He decided to group a certain amount of those other, what had previously got their own class uses in together, and what became E. So now E is called commercial, business and service, and it actually covers now a really wide variety of different uses, which you can see there. So retail, cafes, restaurants, offices, light industrial, some sports and things. So the purpose of Boris doing it was predominantly to instigate town centre economy, and also for things like Dunelm, for example, where they want to put a cafe on the top floor, if it's all in together and all the same class use, you don't now have to go away and get a separate planning application for that X amount of square meters of floor space for the cafe. It now is all within E. So it makes, for those larger businesses, it makes it much more flexible between those uses. And of course, it affects and impacts in a positive way our rural environment as well. So it means, so everything that was sort of destined for those town centre type of uses actually also affects us in the rural environment too. So, and we can benefit from that, and I'll explain that again in a minute. And then after that, basically, if it doesn't fit within, and I'm just talking about commercial uses here, business class uses, there are a variety of other class uses for things like residential and accommodation and all sorts of other things. So we're just, these are the main business ones. If it doesn't fit within those, it is classed as sui generis, which is this Latin word for basically everything else. So agriculture falls into that, and it's just agriculture. Equestrian does, and then some other things as well. So if it doesn't fall into those three, it probably is sui generis. And what it means is that that is a use or a class use by itself. It doesn't fit within any of the others. We're just saying a petrol station is a petrol station. It can't be anything else. So in terms of planning and what you can, hang on, I just managed to take my screen off. In terms of planning and what is required to change the use. So let's start with an agricultural building. You have got an agricultural building of whatever description, of whatever make, model, variety, condition, but if it is genuinely an agricultural building, this is a sort of summary of what planning is required if you want to change that use over to some form of commercial. Now, the first thing is, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail because it's a really useful permitted development right, is that you can change the use of an agricultural building up to 500 square meters of an agricultural building or multiple agricultural buildings, but 500 square meters on an agricultural unit, you can change the use from agriculture to either B8 or E class. And you can do that with permitted development rights, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. So what we're saying, going back to my planning lesson at the start, we're not actually getting planning consent. You have already, subject to meeting certain criteria, got the benefit of these permitted development rights, and so you can change the use of up to that much, subject to meeting the criteria. So anything over 500 square meters on your agricultural unit requires full planning consent for the same uses for B8 and E. But for B2, general industry and sui generis, then anything that goes from agricultural building to B2 or sui generis requires planning consent. So going back to these class uses, and this is, I'm not going to dwell on this particularly, but just some interesting examples perhaps, is occasionally a really random thing comes out and it's difficult to establish what class use it is. Ordinarily and most commonly, it will probably be that, you know, the use unto itself, so the sui generis. It's something that is very specific to that case. So some of the typical rural ones would be, or you know, ones that we see regularly, things like dog kennels, cattery, pubs, equestrian, glamping, farm parks, visitor centres, scrapyards, wedding venues. Those all fall into this sui generis category. So whatever happens, you're always going to need planning consent for a change of use from an agricultural building or indeed land to one of those uses. Some of those others on the left-hand side probably fall into a class E. So you might benefit and be able to use that class R permitted development right. And we are seeing farms diversifying and using this class R for cafes, restaurants, farm shops, things that would fall into light industrial like dog grooming, carpentry workshop, florists. And of course, it also would fit in for things like offices and professional services as well. So So it is actually quite extensive. Some of those things fall into E, and we are using Class R to help to get there. I'm not going to cover accommodation other than what you can read on the screen. It's quite precise, and it wasn't what we wanted to talk about today. But if you want to ask us any questions on sort of changing the use of farm buildings into holiday accommodation, then just give us a call and we'll do our best to answer that for you. So just going through quickly Class R, because this is a very useful permitted development right, which we are using more and more commonly to help farmers sort of almost make the move from agriculture across into commercial. It's 500 square meters, which is reasonably generous anyway. It's 5,000 square feet. But actually, we're sort of using it as part of a strategy in a lot of cases. We've got a client, for example, who's got he's got multiple large-scale steel frame buildings that are redundant. They're not farming anymore, but we've decided to use Class R for the first one. We're going to leave that for 12 months before we start making a planning application to change the use of subsequent buildings. And what that Class R allows us to do is we can, or the client, the applicant, can use that building for commercial use under permitted development for 6 months, 12 months, and at which point it's much easier to demonstrate that there have been no highways issues, that there's been no access issues, there's been no complaints of noise, there's been no neighbouring amenity issues, etc. So you kind of start off with this light touch, get 500 square meters under your belt, and then once you've established that, it is quite useful then, and you can sort of demonstrably be able to go back and say, we've got no issues, now can we start changing the use through the planning applications of other buildings. So I've already sort of really covered what we can use it for, so I won't read that out again. There are a few criteria so as to make sure that you fit in with the Class R. The first one is that the building must be over 10 years old, and it must have been solely in agricultural use for 10 years. And now that's a rolling time thing. So 10 years at the date of application, 500 square meters. It actually says one planning unit. Technically, it is one agricultural unit there. There might be a subtle difference. You can't do this on a listed building where there's a scheduled monument or in a safety hazard area. But the good news is that Class R does apply in a national park, an AONB, and a conservation area. The building doesn't need to be redundant at the time of application. So the procedure, even though I've called it permitted development, which it is, there is still ordinarily a prior approval process. So if the area that you want to change the use is less than 150 square meters, you only need to write a letter notifying the LPA, and we've never had an issue or anything actually come back from that. Between 150 and 500, we have to go through a prior approval notification, which is much like a sort of 28-day notice if you've done one of those for an ag shed. But they can only assess it on one of these four things, which is highways, noise, contamination, and flood risk. So they're not able to start looking at the planning principle or whether the neighbours are going to like it, etc., other than the noise impact on those neighbours. So they can only assess it on those four things. So actually, the Class Rs that we have done have been reasonably smooth, and I would argue that in some instances we've got Class Rs where we wouldn't perhaps have got planning, or it might have been tricky to get planning. So very useful to use that. One thing to just remember about Class R is that the permitted development right only applies to the change of use. So you can't use Class R to undertake any physical works or operational development. So if you need to clad it, add roller shutter doors, anything on the external face of that building, technically you would require a separate planning consent for those. And ordinarily we do the Class R first, then followed by a planning application afterwards. Anything internal doesn't constitute development. So that's just useful to remember that. If you don't have permitted development rights and you need to get full planning consent for the change of use, The first place that we start as agents, or the first thing that a planning officer would do in determining an application for a change of use from agriculture to X or Y, is we need to establish whether they're going to accept the principle, that's the idea of that use in that location. So we're going to ask, can we change the use from this agricultural building to industrial, some sort of sui generis use, or a larger scale storage over and above the 500. And so in order for us to establish whether that's going to be acceptable, we have to go and look at national and local planning policy. And most local planning authorities will have a specific policy contained within their local plan that is something like reuse of rural buildings or something to that effect. And you can go and find that on the website, on the local authority website, find that policy, read that policy and see what it says. Now, the local authorities do vary quite considerably over their sort of approach to reuse of rural buildings. The government and national planning policy tells us that the local authorities should largely support the reuse of rural buildings, especially where it contributes to the rural economy. But of course, much like Neil was saying, really, we have to take each building on its merit, because they're very different in terms of the roads, the highways, who's around it, the neighbours, what that use is going to be. And so obviously that really is where your professional advisors come in terms of making sure that you prepare that planning application so as that it will meet the local planning policy and what it sets out. So these are some of the main things that we have to consider when we're making planning applications. So when you're thinking, if you've got a building in mind and you're thinking, yes, I'm going to need planning for this, and what am I going to need, or what the plan is going to consider, these are the main things. I would say that there's a couple of deal breakers here in terms of possibly even 3 in terms of is there something that would mean that you don't get it at all? One is highways. You've absolutely categorically got to be able to get safe access to it, because obviously the whole point about commercial buildings is that there's going to be a different type of traffic that is going to be accessing those buildings. So we've got to be able to show that we can get safe access. The noise impact as well. So we've got to really consider neighbouring amenity. And of course, that's about what type of use is appropriate for that location. And then occasionally we have come up against it where the impact on listed or heritage assets can be quite a heavy impact on the success or otherwise of it. But all of those things on there are important, and you should consider all of those as you're preparing or approaching a planning application. So this is my last or penultimate slide. This is just one little kind of snippet of strategy for you and how you could perhaps use Class R. So on this farm, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but we've got the little green shed in the left-hand side, and we've got a straw shed next to it. Now, that straw shed is 5,000 square feet or just under, and the little shed is about 2,000. So this is a strategy that we, it's fairly simple, that we came up for this holding. And what we're going to do is use our agricultural permitted development rights, which I talked about earlier. So on most farms, you can have up to 1,000 square meters of new agricultural buildings every 2 years, or 500 every year. So it's quite generous. So on this holding, we are going to apply for 1 or 2 sheds over on the right hand side there. So we'll pop in an application under a 28-day notice for 1 or 2 sheds under our agricultural permitted development, after which the shed in the middle there, assuming that it meets the criteria and it's been there for 10 years, etc., then that shed in the middle will be suitable and eligible for Class R. So we have we can get the permission for the new sheds, then we can change the use of an existing shed under Class R to commercial. And on this holding, it's reasonably easy to sort of carve out an area. We've got a driveway that goes up. We can make an area that includes those 2 buildings, which comes out at about 7,000 square foot. And just to give you some really ballpark figures, it's going to cost you in the region of 50k or so to build your new shed at the back there. You're probably going to have to concrete the floor of the existing shed, and then we're in a position to let out 7,000 square feet of shed. Neil will tell me differently if £5 is unreasonable, but if it's in a good location and you're using it for sort of workshop, light industrial, that sort of thing, it might be achievable. And that would give us, for those two buildings, a 35 grand a year income. So we're not losing any agricultural buildings because we've replaced them with the ones at the back. So it's not affecting the farm, but using permitted development rights, so agricultural followed by R, we have just managed to free up 5,000 to 7,000 square feet of commercial space, creating ourselves a potential income of that sort of money. So using these permitted development rights and a little bit of strategy can be quite a powerful thing, especially, as Nicola alluded to, in the light of, you know, losing BPS and so on, and plugging that gap. So we are the Rural Planning Co. That's my presentation finished. We specialise in agriculture, equestrian, rural business and residential. We work all the way across England. We're really proud of our success rate. We try really hard to get things right for our clients and deliver a really high level of customer service. So if you've got any questions and you'd like to get in touch, then please give us a ring. We're more than happy to answer any questions over the phone and see what we can do for you. So I'm finished, Nicola, I think.
Brilliant, thank you, Hannah. So in terms of questions, we've actually got a question here which from Darren, but I think you've probably covered it in your presentation. The question was, do I need specific rental permission for buildings that I already have permission granted for B1 and B2 use? I'm guessing you need to know what he would like permission for to answer that question, or?
It just broke up a little bit. He's got permission for B1 and B2.
Yes, and does he need specific rental permission for buildings that already have that?
I'm not quite sure, if I'm honest, what he means by rental permission. So B1, which was previously light industrial, will now be E class. And so he can change. I don't know whether he means there's one on two different buildings or whether it's a mixed use on one building. But if, say, for example, the scenario was that he'd got E class or B1 on a building, which now is E, he can change within any of the uses of E. If it is B2, which is industrial, then there are some permitted development rights, which I now can't remember off the top of my head, to change the use from B2 to possibly E. I'd have to just check that. But if he wants to email that over to us, Nicola.
Okay,
I'm happy just to go back to my email.
Okay, great. One from a lady called Erica, and she's talking about a couple of questions. The first, that she has looked at a commercial property for sale. This might be Alex or Neil, to be honest. She's looked at a commercial property for sale, a mixed residential and commercial units. There is a squatter in one of the commercial units and listed as a commercial squatter. She's questioning how tricky that is.
Well, from a legal perspective, that would be one I hand straight over to my litigation colleagues to see how tricky it is. I think that the first thing would be to establish what the basis of the squatter's occupation is, whether it's a lease that's expired and they're holding over, or whether there's no lease, and you'd need to know an awful lot of the sort of the facts around their occupation to work out what statutory framework they might occupy under, and possibly question the landlord and tenant act I mentioned before the litigators would work out the costs and procedure to remove them if they don't have, you know, a statutory right to be there. So yeah, that's one for the litigators, and I'm very happy to field those queries to pass on to colleagues in my litigation team if that would help.
Fabulous, thank you.
I think my only advice on further to that would be, if you're looking at buying something and it's an investment, you've got to do your due diligence at the start prior to purchase. So it's worth spending the money on the professional advice at the start.
Yeah, great, thank you. Again from Erica, she's interested, if you were letting a barn and if it was for animals, does an EPC or an MWES apply?
Sorry, you got that, Neil?
There's a difference, I think, between agriculture and industrial here, agriculture and commercial. Yeah, if it's a commercial building, you need an EPC outside of the criteria that Alex mentioned on the presentation. I haven't seen any commercial buildings with animals in so far, so I'm guessing it's an agricultural use. But again, we just need to understand what the question is, what is being asked.
Okay.
I think that the default position would be agricultural, so exempt, unless it was something quirky like a farm park or something where, but I suppose that perhaps maybe might be commercial, maybe.
Okay. One from Jen. If a farm building gets planning for commercial use and subsequently has rates applied, can you get the rates removed easily enough if they ever wanted to go back to agricultural use?
My understanding is yes. I would need to put that into a rating surveyor ultimately to give the full picture, but that is my understanding. Yeah, I mean, I think you need to think about the reasons. I think we need to think about the reasons as to why it's being asked. If, for example, it's a commercial building that is empty and is not generating any rent and they want to mitigate the cost, there are other ways outside of dropping it back into agricultural use. It can be done with relative ease, but it's going the other way again.
Yeah, okay.
You would run the risk of sort of losing your commercial status then, wouldn't you, on it? And
yeah. There are ways to mitigate the business rates when you've got an empty building, commercial building.
Yeah. Maybe Jen thinks that agriculture is going to come back round as the financially sound proposition. Right. Simon asks, they've got a small existing agricultural building, less than 150 square meters in 2 acres, want to change to small office storage workshop, assume Class E. Class R PD requiring only written notification letter to the LPA, but is there any minimum land requirement? And also, let's go to the question, also, is there any PD allowance for even smallest external alterations? For example, a single new window. Does even the smallest works require a planning application? Hannah, I suppose.
So the first part of the question is there any minimum land requirement? No, there isn't a minimum land requirement. There's no sort of quantifiable level in the permitted development order, but it needs to be on an agricultural unit. So it would have to sort of have the characteristics of being an agricultural unit, even if it's a small holding. So I'm comparing it a little bit to like a Class Q, which is agricultural to residential, and there's no limit on that. We've just got to be able to show that it was genuinely an agricultural building. So I think probably the same would apply to a Class R as well. So no, I don't think there's any size limit. In terms of the works, the only thing I can think of is whether it would fall under de minimis or something. So, you know, the work is so small that it's almost negligible. But I think if you're technically, it, you know, probably will need planning.
Yeah.
You know, whether anybody's down a lot lane in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Whether anybody's,
yeah.
You know, but to give the technical answer, I think it probably, any external works would probably require planning consent.
Yeah, but as always, you know, if you can always call us with the details and we can help.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the Darren's question, the combined B1, B2 permission was originally granted for all of the farm buildings, primarily for my own business, which was based in my farm. The business is now not operational, so looking to instead to rent the buildings to third parties. So that was the question about, do I need specific rental permission on buildings he'd already got B1 and B2 use?
Oh, okay, so to rent them out rather than use them for himself.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he'd need to go back and look at the original decision notice when he got the permission to see if there were any conditions that limited it to his own use. It's unlikely that there were, but occasionally it does happen. The councils don't tend to like doing personal permissions, but occasionally it does happen. So he would need to go back and look at the decision notice and see if it was just a general grant of B1, B2, or if it was a grant of B1, B2, but with a condition saying it must be occupied by a given person or a given business, or if it was in the description that it was for a given person or a given business. So he would need to go back and look at the decision notice. If there was nothing that specified it had to be operated by him, then he wouldn't need permission to rent them out. A separate permission.
Can I just add, if you're thinking of letting a property that is charged or has a mortgage, you're likely to need consent from your lender to grant those leases, especially if those leases need registering.
Okay.
Yeah, good shout.
Thank you. What is the position with rates on commercial buildings? Neil, I suppose that's you, is it?
It can be for the headlines. It's not my field, but yeah, rates are payable on commercial property. It's something that the owners of the buildings will need to think about in terms of the future cost. It's something that you can mitigate. There are ways and means around the full payment of those rates. You do get rates-free holidays, which vary from use class to use class, whether it be industrial or offices. But the default position is that it is payable, subject to the size of the building, because without going into too much detail, but a building of a given rateable value may or may not be subject to rates at all. So if it's below £12,000 a year, then there's no rates payable on the industrial buildings, and then there's a sliding scale ultimately beyond that. But yeah, that is the default position. The best thing to do again is case by case, get some advice, speak to a rating surveyor, and they'll be able to help you.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got loads of questions, but we'll just do a couple more. I have just changed from agricultural use to Class E for a space for health and wellness sessions under 150 metres. If I wanted to add a small refreshment area, is this allowed without further notification or permissions?
I think, assuming it's within the 150, yeah, I think that's fine because it's all within the E. If it's within the 150, if you go over the 150, then you might, yeah, if you're changing the size, then you'd probably need a prior notification. But if it's less than, if it's still within the original 150, then it's still all within the E.
Okay, okay.
Is my interpretation of that.
Okay. If a tenant has security of tenure and you evicted them, refused renewal with redevelopment clause, would you still owe them compensation of the rateable value?
Yes. Yeah. So that compensation is for circumstances where a tenant with statutory rights is denied those on one of the permitted grounds by a landlord. So yes, that's when compensation would apply. And it's probably worth saying a lease can go some way to exclude that statutory compensation for leases that are, or where a tenant has the security of tenure. But yeah, the basic position is yes, that's when the compensation is due.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. We have gone over time now, so I apologise to all those people who we haven't got to their question, but I'd say on behalf of all of us, if you have any questions, please do email in. I can move those questions out to the people who can answer them. So don't hesitate to contact us, and we can help you. So thank you so much to Neil and Alex, and of course Hannah, but thank you very much for joining us on the webinar, and I hope people have found it useful. We do have a series of webinars. I know somebody here has asked, do we have any for conversion of unused agricultural buildings? We've got a class Q1 coming up next on the 17th, I think, of July. Just email us and I can send you out the details of that. But thank you very much, guys, for joining us, and I hope people have found it useful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Bye.